Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
Our broadcast today is brought to you by EvolveFish.com, the official merchandiser for this weekend's Gateway to Reason conference that's coming up in St. Louis. And of course, they're a presence at many free thought events all across the nation and have been for many, many years. In fact, Evolve Fish was a pioneer in sort of selling heathen merchandise years and years ago, and they partnered up with many of the biggest names in the movement. T-shirts, emblems, jewelry, mugs, patches, tags, pins, keychains, a whole lot more. It is the official store for The Thinking Atheist, with coffee mugs and beer mugs, shot glasses, wine glasses, and of course T-shirts, including our most popular shirt, I think, the one that has the Atheist A emblem on it, and it says, "I have a personal relationship with reality." So populate your life with messages that promote reason with style and the occasional bit of sarcasm. You can check out the great work Tom, Margaret, and Gavin are doing over at EvolveFish.com. Get your message out, start some conversations, just find something cool to put up on the shelf, inside the cubicle, or on yourself. EvolveFish.com. Tonight's broadcast has two parts to it. The first part is the audio from Dr. Darrel Ray's presentation from June 20th of this year at the Oklahoma Free Thought Convention. He did a fascinating speech called The Myth of Sex Addiction. And we have a lot of people who've seen the video, but a lot more people listen to the podcast, and I thought it would make good material for the radio. So I'm just going to play the audio of that presentation, and of course the video link will be in the description box, so when he references a few slides and you can't really see what he's talking about, you can go back after the fact. So I'm going to play that, and then we're going to come back and actually have Dr. Darrel Ray on the radio to talk more in depth about some of the things he brings up during the speech. And we'll go another 30, 45 minutes with Dr. Ray in studio, or via Skype, rather. So it's going to be an interesting broadcast as we talk about the myth of sex addiction. Before we do that, a couple of shows on the horizon. Let me just toss this out. Next Tuesday, we're going to talk about the apologists. I've got a show scheduled called The Loose Screws, Apologetics Gone Wild, as we explore some of the more weird, wacky, and often jaw-droppingly insane things being presented by God's champions to defend the faith. We've all got our favorite sort of fringe apologists out there. I'm not talking about mainstream people using mainstream arguments. I mean some of the wackier, more bizarre things that we are seeing out there, because it seems like as the rise of reason is happening, especially here in the USA, right? We're starting to see fundamentalism fall away, and we're seeing the champions of the Bible and other faiths are becoming more desperate. And they're beginning to froth at the mouth and do and say some freaky things. So if you have a favorite, somebody comes to mind, somebody's charged, somebody's sermon, somebody said something, wrote something, broadcast something somewhere, and you want to nominate that for the broadcast, send me an email to podcast@thethinkingatheist.com. We'll take some of the best ones, and we're going to highlight them. You may want to surround yourself next Tuesday with like soft things, pillows and poofy blankets, because there will be some head banging, some face palming, some craniums crashing against the wall out of sheer monumental frustration, but it will also be wildly entertaining, and it will be sort of a revelation again as to what we're up against as we go after some really bad ideas being posited by the religious. Coming up later in August, I'm thinking about trying an experiment. It's not a show about atheism per se, but it does speak to real life in the real world. I have tentatively called it the butterfly effect. I've been fascinated lately about how the supposedly innocuous things, the inconsequential things that we say and do in our everyday lives, can propel us into directions and into situations, often life-changing situations we never before thought possible. We just never saw it coming, you know. You sit down in a chair next to a person. You walk through a door into a building at a specific time and bump into someone who changes your life. You know, maybe they become your spouse. Maybe they lead you into a career path you never before anticipated. Maybe they awaken in you questions that you never knew you had before, or maybe never had the courage to ask. You know, you do or say something, you end up somewhere where something really small happens. And that really small thing changes everything. Those kind of stories fascinate me, and I think they'll be interesting to the radio audience. And in fact, I think many in our audience have stories like this, you know. Hey, if I hadn't been here at this particular moment, this whole rest of my life would have never happened the way it did. You know, the kind of thing where religious people will say, well, this is divine providence, right? God opened the door. God led you. And of course, we don't see it that way. But if you have a story or perspective along those lines, shoot me an email to podcast@thethinkingatheist.com. And I think that show is going to air sometime in mid-August. And we're going to hear some amazing and I think compelling stories during that show. I'm looking forward to putting it together. Right now, we start with tonight's broadcast featuring Dr. Darrel Ray. Dr. Ray is founder and chairman of the board of directors for Recovering from Religion. He's been a psychologist for over 30 years. He's written several books, including The God Virus, How Religion Infects Our Lives and Culture, and Sex and God, How Religion Distorts Sexuality. He holds a master's in religion, as well as a bachelor's in sociology and anthropology, and a doctorate in psychology. He's also director of the Secular Therapy Project, which is matching up clients with secular therapists, therapists who aren't operating from a religious agenda. And that's a really interesting program that he's been behind. Dr. Darrel Ray, the presentation is called The Myth of Sex Addiction.
All right. Well, thanks. It's great to be in Tulsa again. One of the first places I spoke after the God Virus came out was here in Tulsa at the invitation of Kenny Knipp. Anybody know that guy? Love that guy. Sorry he's not here today, though, unfortunately. So I want to, first of all, give a couple plugs in. Rhonda Dorley, anybody know that lady? All right. She has been a faithful member of Recovering from Religion since way back, and she runs the group here, and she wanted me to give a plug for the RR group here. As you probably know, I started and founded RR back in 2009, but now we've got the great Sarah Moorhead. How many of you know Sarah? All right, cool. Running the organization, and she's making me look like an amateur. She's amazing with all sorts of stuff going on. And let's see. First of all, we just announced the hotline, the Recovering from Religion hotline. If you have a faith crisis, or you know somebody that has a faith crisis, they can call us, and we will quietly and calmly talk to you about anything you want. We're not here to convert or deconvert you, but we're here to listen to you. We've got over 80 volunteers answering the phones every evening of the week and 24 hours on the weekend. So let people know about 84 I Doubt It. 84 I Doubt It is the phone number. And you probably also know, I don't think this thing's working too well, there we go, about the Secular Therapy Project. It's another component of the Recovering from Religion. It's a part of this whole thing. Like No Longer Quivering is a part of the support network, and the Secular Therapist Project, and Recovering from Religion, and the Foundation Beyond Belief, and oh gosh, I just drew a blank. There's so many of these groups, and we're trying to confederate. We're all trying to. Rebecca Hensler, No Longer Grieving, or Grief Beyond Belief. I'm sorry. And all these groups, we're trying to create a support system for seculars in the United States, in North America, in the whole world, actually. So if you know somebody that needs a good secular therapist, somebody that's not going to send you back to church or pray with you or read your chakras, go to seculartherapy.org. And we guarantee nobody's going to be religious in our database, because there's 4 of us atheists and you have to pass by all 4 of us. So to hear more about what I'm going to talk about today, the myth of sex and porn addiction, you can go to my podcast, the Secular Sexuality Podcast, and I talk about this on episode number 9. But also, I've got a couple other talks on it. So if after today you've got more questions, want to see more about it, I'll give you several resources before we're finished. Just like to always share some artwork. This is what was really going on before the Vatican censored it. So let's begin with a question. How many of you masturbate? I do. Come on, let's see it. All right. Now, imagine if I asked that question in a Catholic church, or a Seventh-day Adventist. Where's Ryan at? Ryan, Seventh-day Adventist church. No hands would go up, and yet about 2/3 of you, and the rest of you are lying, raised your hands in here. So I want you to keep that in mind as I talk about this whole notion of the myth of sex and porn addiction. So what we're going to do today, I'm going to identify the roots of the whole concept of sex and porn addiction. I'm going to try to explain why this is a very destructive idea relative to sex-positive human sexuality. I've met so many atheists. I say there's no such thing as sex addiction, and they say, oh yes there is, my cousin's a sex addict. So we're going to find out about your cousin today. I'm going to talk about the science, or the lack thereof, in this concept. And we're going to look at some underlying issues about, well, okay, people do have trouble with sex. I'm not denying that. But what does that really mean? And we're going to explore what that means for you or for people you love or care about. So is there a problem? I'm going to play a short video of an interview I did with the Australian Broadcasting System a couple years ago. I want you to watch this and see if you can spot any problems with the way they're conceptualizing and using this notion of sex and porn addiction.
Now, changing directions, Todd, you're bringing us our feature story tonight.
Yeah, the debate about whether porn addiction is real or not has been around for a long time, but when you add religion to it, it gets even more complicated.
It was kind of taking over every kind of aspect of my life.
Jason Huxley is a loving husband, father, and a devout Christian. He's also a former addict. But alcohol or drugs aren't his vice. Porn is.
I was staying up late at night watching stuff, getting up early on Saturday mornings. You know, Laura would have a sleep in and I'd have a porn in. And, you know, it sounds terrible, but that's just what I did.
Jason married Laura when he was 22. While he'd watched porn before that, he says it was only after the wedding his viewing habits spiraled out of control, to the point where he was watching up to 8 hours at a time.
And I was viewing this stuff and thinking, you know, well, I'm not really getting that kind of action in the bedroom. One day I decided she's not kind of the woman for me anymore. There's better options out there.
It's one thing to have reality, another thing to have fantasy. Fantasy never has sort of bad hair days or bad mood swings or anything like that that normal life has.
Laura refused to let Jason walk away from their marriage and agreed to help him kick the habit. She even started taking the modem with her when she left the house.
That lasted about a week until I went out and bought another modem.
Without me. I didn't know about that.
So I had a decoy modem.
But the catalyst was when Jason spent a whole day viewing pornography when he was meant to be painting the house.
It kind of really hit me. Here I am, spent the whole day viewing porn, which I'm not meant to be doing, with a modem that I'm not meant to have. I've taken the day off work, so I could have been earning money today, but I didn't. No, it was just screwing up my life.
While it's clear some people are viewing porn compulsively, there is still plenty of debate in the medical community about whether it is an actual addiction, like drugs, alcohol, or gambling. Some believe it's a subcategory of sex addiction, but even that hasn't formally been recognized as an official psychiatric disorder.
I get really cross with people who say pornography is not something that you can become addicted to, because in my practice I'm seeing people, men and women, who are addicted to watching pornography, and it's seriously affecting their lives.
Because of his religiosity, Jason seems like an unlikely porn addict. But in fact, recent research out of the US has found the more religious a person is, the more likely they are to believe they're addicted to porn.
Here's a way to understand this. Don't think of a pink elephant. The minute you tell somebody not to do something, it pops into their head. If you're being told since the day you were born, that sex is bad, sex is wrong. It's like religion is constantly reminding you of the very thing it doesn't want you to think about.
I tried to stop so many times, and I just didn't know why I couldn't stop.
Luke Gibbons is 29, Christian, and a virgin. Like Jason, he discovered porn in his teens.
Although I was viewing like several times in the week, but it was probably the length of time, so I saw it taking up sort of all night, and I just would be glued there all night until early morning and get an hour's sleep and then go to work with hardly any sleep.
In his mid-20s, Luke checked into a rehab clinic.
There were people of all addictions in this rehab, so people who suffered from drug addiction, alcohol addiction. It was a hard time, it was pretty full on, but also the most worthwhile 6 weeks of my life.
Today, Luke abstains from pornography, just like he abstains from sex.
Porn isn't the problem, absence is the problem. Human beings are programmed to reproduce. And by 16, almost every human being on this planet has got hormones that are driving them to do something sexually.
I don't think that abstinence is suppressing sexuality. I think it is an expression of sexuality. So if you want to wait until you're married, then that can be a really good thing if you want to save that until you meet the person that you want to be with.
Like Luke, Jason is now porn-free. He installed porn-blocking software on his computer and hasn't viewed the stuff in 5 years. Today, both men run the charity Guilty Pleasure, educating people about the harmful effects of pornography.
It's kind of scary. We're meant to be not viewing the stuff, according to scripture, and we are.
The church makes you think you have a problem, then they give you a fake cure. Come back to church to get over the guilt that we taught you in the first place. It's a great marketing campaign.
Yeah, that's a really controversial thought, that the church markets guilt, which then fuels porn addiction, and then the church sells itself as a solution to that. I don't know how accurate that is, but it is a big thought.
I know it reminds me of church because they're constantly saying, oh God, oh God.
I just want to take my hat off. I want to take my hat off to the guys in that story, because that would be a really tough thing to have to talk about a porn addiction, but also to Laura, Jason's wife, to have to hear your husband talk about your sex life in that way. I thought she handled it with all, with such class, and she made really good points.
And obviously they've been doing it for a while. I mean, and there's obviously some banter that they use. I mean, when he said, he has his porn in, I mean, like, they obviously got to the stage where they can joke about it a little bit. Yeah.
All right, we'll be back after the break.
You recognize any patterns in this? I mean, these folks are guilty as hell, but where'd they learn the guilt about what they're doing? And what we know now, and there's lots of research showing, the more religious you are, the more you're likely to identify yourself as a porn or a sex addict. We're going to talk about that a lot here today. So, first of all, you heard concepts called around religious purity. Did you hear anything about the spouse shaming the other person? Did you hear any clinical diagnosis? She diagnosed her husband as a porn addict. There wasn't any clinical diagnosis in there. That was a spousal diagnosis. And we see that a lot. We see spouses and parents doing that. We saw also a denial of sexuality through religious-inspired abstinence. Abstinence is an expression of sexuality. Right, okay. Parent-child relationships between adults. She is his mother, and he even has nanny software to make sure he's behaving himself as the little boy. So it's not an adult-to-adult relationship in this marriage, it's a mother-child relationship. And as I said earlier, the spouse is doing all the diagnosing. In 1983, a fellow named Patrick Carnes, who has a PhD in psychology, I have no idea how he got it, started the concept of sex addiction, and he's made an entire cottage industry out of it. I don't know how much money this guy makes, but if you just Google sex addiction, within usually one click, certainly within 2 or 3 clicks, you will find Patrick Carnes behind this. It's enormous, and it has just taken off. He's written book about every 2 or 3 years. He writes another book on sex addiction or porn addiction or something like that. This guy put it on the map, literally, Wikipedia puts him as the founder and starter of all the stuff that we now think of as sex addiction. Now, how many of you took the test I put out? Okay, stand up if you took the test. All right, now I have a confession to make here. My name is Darrel Ray, and I am a sex addict. I am a porn addict. I'm sorry. Okay, so look around, see all the people who are standing up. Of those people who took the survey, Stay standing if you're a porn addict or a sex addict, according to that survey. Sit down if you're not. Okay, look at that. By my calculations, thank you folks, thank you for your help. We have a lot of sex addicts in here, and that's just the people who took the test. I'm sorry. If you score 13 or higher, you're a sex addict. Sorry about that, folks. How many of us scored? Oh, right, good. Several. Sorry, should have gave the numbers up there. Here's the problem. When I give this and I hand it out to people, I get them, 80% of the people I give it to score as a sex addict. Isn't that interesting? How can anything be valid if 80% of the people are it? A good psychometric test discriminates well. Now, if you go and you look at the literature, Patrick Carn is full of praise for his survey, and clinics all over the United States, even the world, are using it, but it's a damn fucking crazy bad survey. It's amazingly bad. If you know anything about psychometrics, you can say the first 3 or 4 questions give it away. That survey is not valid. It's simply not valid at all. And we'll understand why shortly. So, the DSM-5 just came out recently, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, where we can diagnose through scientifically based criteria different mental illnesses and mental conditions. Here's the criteria for sex addiction. Criteria number 1, criteria number 2, and criteria number 3. Yeah, that's the criteria for sex addiction. And the whole sex addiction industry is up in arms and really angry because there is no diagnosis of sex addiction or porn addiction in the DSM-5. We have thousands of sex addiction counselors out there being trained, oftentimes in religious universities. Does that surprise you? Especially Mormon universities like Brigham Young. That is like the sex addiction central. Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, I believe it is. So people like her writing blogs, marriage and family counselors, they're the ones most interested in sex addiction, it seems like, are saying it is beyond belief that psychological and psychiatric world did not put the sex addiction diagnosis into DSM-5. Well, let me help you understand why there is no sex addiction diagnosis and no scientifically validated criteria for diagnosing either sex addiction or porn addiction. That is from this fellow, Alan Francis, who was the chairman of the task force for the DSM-4. I mean, this guy's like top of the list. Here's what he says about the whole sex addiction thing. Sexuality is an inherently difficult area for psychiatric diagnosis because, number 1, the field has generated remarkably little research and few researchers. Number 2, there are no consensus norms in sexual behavior to provide useful boundaries in deciding what constitutes a sexual mental disorder. Number 3, individual and cultural biases play a large and difficult role in sorting out the roles. And 4, decisions, this is the most important one, decisions regarding diagnosis of sexual disorder can have profound and unanticipated forensic societal implications. Alan Turing was mentally disordered because he was a homosexual, one of the greatest minds that ever lived on the face of the planet, and he committed suicide because society had labeled him a sexual deviant. And that's what this is all about. Societal norms are what's causing this to happen. We cannot find any scientific criteria for defining what a sex or a porn addiction is. We just can't. And believe me, there are hundreds of psychologists, psychiatrists have worked thousands and thousands of hours trying to figure out how to define it, and they can't. And yet we have counselors all over the United States diagnosing people with sexual addictions and porn addictions. It is a crime. Unfortunately, it causes a lot of crime too. Dr. Francis's biggest concern is that the poorly defined diagnosis can have lifelong consequences. Right now, juvenile judges are using sex and porn addiction as criteria for putting children into foster homes or putting children into juvenile detention or putting children into rehabilitation centers, even sending them off to sex addiction rehabilitation centers. 12, 13, 14-year-old, mostly boys, getting sent off to these places. Bad criteria leads to people being indefinitely imprisoned and can cause a lifetime of angst and problems within a person because they were diagnosed with a fake diagnosis. If you hear a little passion on my part, it's because people are being hurt every day by this. And we as atheists probably don't see it. Oh yeah, sex addiction, no big deal. You're not in the courts every day. You're not seeing boys and girls being sent places they shouldn't be sent to that's going to damage them for the rest of their life because of this concept. And you're also not seeing your sister-in-law labeling your brother a sex addict is a really big deal. Well, it is a big deal to your brother because he's probably not. There's no such thing. So, what we see is a lot of focus lately in our culture on abstinence and purity in our culture, especially in the religious. And what happens is these religions set impossibly high expectations, and then where do you have to come to get forgiveness? Back to the church, back to Christianity, back to Islam. Wherever it was, you learned it in the first place. It is a model based on Alcoholics Anonymous, by the way, which we'll talk a little bit later about. And it creates a helplessness model. You are helpless and irresponsible for your behavior because you are a sex addict. You are a porn addict. So it's not really your fault. It really creates a disease model for this rather than a responsibility model. And that's what I advocate, is a responsibility model rather than a disease model. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Here's, I took that right off J.T. Everhart's blog one day. I said, shit, this is too good to be true. This fellow, he's a Christian Catholic apologist, and he says in this video that masturbation is bad because you might fantasize. And fantasizing is bad if it has anything to do with sex. So if you watch porn, by his definition, he says it right on the video, you are a porn addict. So how many of you have watched porn in here? Okay, right. So, according to this fellow, you are all sex and porn addicts. By his definition. And I'll tell you, his definition goes a long ways because he's a major speaker for the Catholic Church in North America. So, what are the consequences? It makes people feel like they're acting in abnormal ways when they're acting perfectly normal. If any of you listen to my podcast, you've heard all the interviews I do. There's one question I ask everybody that I interview in my podcast. When did you start masturbating? I always do. And it's always a fun and interesting story to tell. But people, that's a normal thing, and yet religion teaches masturbation as something that's abnormal, against God's will, and all those sorts of things. It tends to evoke a blame model. It labels people for behaving normally. But most importantly, it opens the door for teaching shame and guilt around your own body. And it starts really, really early. I watched my grandmother. My youngest brother was born. I'm about 5 years old at the time, or 6 years old. I'm in the room while my grandmother is changing the diapers of my little brother, and he reaches down to touch his penis. And I watched my grandmother slap his hand away from his penis. Slap his hand violently. Now, that is a sexual message, isn't it? She was fucked up as hell when it came to sex, by the way. But that message got through to me. Oh, it's wrong to touch your penis. My brother was probably too young to know what had just happened, but I wasn't, and that memory is still up here. So when you think about when are people being sexually programmed, it starts almost at infancy in our culture. So if you feel religious shame and guilt, you may not realize it comes from religion, but it almost always does. And last, it promotes an anti-science agenda in the practice of psychology and counseling. Unfortunately, there are probably more counselors and psychologists out there that will talk and work with you as a sex addict or a porn addict than there are the ones that won't. That is how pervasive this concept has become in this culture, that even people who should know better are buying into it. There's a whole addictions industry out there, and it's really lucrative. If you can get somebody sent to an addictions rehab center, you can collect a lot of money from a lot of different places. But the research on addiction is woefully inadequate, as we heard earlier. There is actually no peer-reviewed research in the last 50 years that shows that Alcoholics Anonymous works. Let me repeat that. There has been no research in the last 50 years that shows Alcoholics Anonymous has any impact on alcoholic rehabilitation. Nada, zero. There's no peer-reviewed scientific research that shows sex addiction treatment helps anybody. There's actually some research that shows it may actually hurt people. I would submit I know that it hurts people. There's no peer-reviewed research that shows abstinence programs for Alcoholics Anonymous or Sex Anonymous works. Abstinence doesn't work either. So why are people out there flogging this notion of sex addiction and porn addiction if it doesn't work? Because there's a lot of other things going on there. First of all, we need to realize that the Alcoholics Anonymous world, going back to 1936, when whatever his name is started the whole thing, started with a disease model. It tries to say that once you get the disease of alcoholism, it progresses until you die. Now, there's absolutely no research that shows that. There's never been a single study that shows once you abuse alcohol here, you're going to die of alcoholism over here. But that's the myth that's been propagated throughout the United States, throughout the world in many ways, around alcohol, and Alcoholics Anonymous has been doing a great job of propagating that myth. Unfortunately, now they've moved it into sex addiction because, you know, it's a new opportunity for marketing. So now how does abstinence work with alcohol? How does abstinence work with sex addiction? Well, it works a lot worse with sex addiction, by the way. And there's no evidence for either one of these as a treatment modality. So, there's no research because Alcoholics Anonymous is a religion. There's no science behind Alcoholics Anonymous. Alcoholics Anonymous would never fund scientific research that shows it's useless. So they go to great lengths to not allow any kind of access to their system, to their database, to anything else. Of course, it's under this anonymous notion, but there's no proof or evidence that Alcoholics Anonymous works. 50 years of research, actually going back 80 years almost. The same thing true of Sex Addiction Anonymous, SA. There's no evidence that it works either. No peer-reviewed research. Now, there's lots of anecdotal research. There's lots of anecdotal stories. But as we all know, we can find anybody to tell us anything about something sooner or later. I mean, those two guys are no longer sex addicts. Do you believe that? What you saw in that video? So Alcoholics Anonymous and Sexaholics Anonymous is just religion disguised as valid therapy. And it's not valid therapy in the psychological world. If you don't believe me, look through this. I took the 12 steps. Of course, the 12 steps of Sexaholics Anonymous just was stolen directly from Alcoholics Anonymous. How many references to powerless and power greater than me and God? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Of the 12 steps, 10 of them have to deal with some kind of a God or higher power or your powers or your worthlessness. That doesn't sound like a treatment modality I want anything to do with. You're a worthless, useless human being, but you got to come to us to get any kind of treatment. Sounds like a good marketing tool for guilt and shame, which is what religion does best. So I call this the Oprah effect. Now, I think, is Paris Hilton, is she a sex addict? I don't know. Conflict over sex addiction is important to humanists for several reasons. Sex addiction is a special weapon now used by the religious right to combat perceived liberalism, to ignore science, and to ignite fear. It also helps legitimize anti-sex moralism and bigotry, and psychologists, judges, legislators, and the media are buying into it. This is a direct quote from Marty Klein's book, article on You Are Addicted to What? ? And his book, America's War on Sex, an excellent book. After you've read my books, you should go read his after that. So, I call it the Oprah effect. Oprah is, of course, the best psychologist we've got right now. This is David Vitter, who loves him some prostitutes, but is he a sex addict? I'm just curious, is he a sex addict? People are labeling other people based on criteria that come off of Oprah. Dr. Phil, Dr. Drew, I'll talk about later. He's my bugaboo. People are self-diagnosing. What did that survey ask you? I know I'm a sex addict, right? Wasn't it question number 3 or something like that? I know I'm a sex addict. What criteria did you use to decide you were a sex addict? You know, how many people say, you know, I know I've got leukemia? Yeah, right. No, you got to have some criteria for deciding whether you've got leukemia or not. Some white blood cell counts or something like that. Spouses are diagnosing their partners. I want my husband to go to treatment because he masturbates too much. He doesn't fuck me enough. Or something like that. So-called addiction professionals are diagnosing and treating people based on unscientific criteria. They're often based on hidden religious assumptions. And if I can get this to go. Here's a website, the 10 Signs of Porn Addiction. Okay, you want to read this because you want to find out if you're a porn addict, especially if you want to find out if you're a husband, because it's almost always husbands. You almost never hear about women or females being identified as sex addicts. But when you look behind this just a little bit, you see that. Covenant Eyes. You know what Covenant Eyes is? Nanny software. So what they're trying to say is, if one of these 10 items says your husband's a sex addict, you better put nanny software onto your computer so you can tell if your husband's watching porn when you don't want him to be watching. Wow, what kind of a relationship is that if you're supervising your husband? And it's almost always husbands. I'm not saying women can't enjoy porn, but the identification of sex addict almost always comes that direction. I was listening to our local NPR station, KCUR, back in October 9th, 2013, and I was driving down the road. I almost had a wreck. I heard this woman, she's a PhD psychologist, talking about sex addiction with some marriage and family counselor on this popular talk radio show we've got on NPR. And I couldn't believe the stuff she was saying. And I couldn't believe that the host wasn't challenging her on anything. Well, it's only 10 minutes in, right? I get on the phone, I call. What do you want to ask question? Well, I'd like to challenge the whole idea of sex and porn addiction. I didn't. Somehow 5 other people got on to ask questions. They never let me on to ask the question. So I wrote a letter to the station manager. I wrote a letter to the host. I've written 5 letters now. I've had 2 of my friends write letters. They have yet to respond to me, not once. I said, basically, you let somebody get on your show and talk about something that has no scientific basis, but you will not let me on your show to talk about the science behind this or lack thereof. So I did a little research on this woman. Now look at this. Look at all those letters behind her name. Those all mean she's really good. She's even written books. She runs this place called Safe Passages, Your Addicted Spouse, How Partners Can Cope and Heal, of course. So she's really got a lot going for her. So I went in, I looked at what her background was. Dr. Barbara Stevens, PhD, Regent University. Regent. Do you realize if you get a PhD in psychology at Regent University, you're required to spend 1 full year of your PhD postdoc work studying Pat Robertson's theology? that hurricanes destroy cities because of gays? That's what Pat Robertson preaches. That's where she went. And we'll look at all the other religious schools she went to. They did not tell you where she got her education. That was another question I wanted to ask. Where'd you get your PhD? It wasn't the University of Chicago, I'm pretty sure of that. It wouldn't have been from Kansas University probably, but it would have been from... What this tells me, and you should know this, many PhD level people and many marriage and family counselors are being graduated from fundamentalist religious schools. And they are passing licensure. They can get licensed in your state, and then they have a religious agenda to keep you infected with the God virus. And to keep you, and what we know is the more religious a person is, the more likely they are to be susceptible to things like depression oftentimes, and to not get the kind of treatment they need for the mental illness they have. Well, if you go to a Christian counselor who's been really poorly trained, and they diagnose you as a sex addict, it's worse than worse. You were misdiagnosed, and now you're being mistreated. I'll get into that in more detail in a minute here. Regent's user, I want to read you just one part. Our curriculum trains psychologists in a manner consistent with the biblical truths and historic Christian worldview. Now let's go to the bottom. In this course, students can expect the instructor to both guide and join students in understanding the role and effect of the fallen human condition on mental health and well-being. Did you know that the Bible is a mental health training book? The fallen condition. I wonder what kind of mental health training you get when you believe that the fall was the beginning of all mental health problems, and the Bible could solve those problems. That's where this person got her PhD, and she was on the radio propagating this shit to thousands of people. The sex addiction field is really a form of religious indoctrination in my estimation. It has shaming, especially shaming of men. It also recruits women to participate in this shaming process. The nanny software, the majority of articles in any women's magazine or any women's website is on men, husbands, boyfriends, significant others being the males being the porn and sex addicts. And there are entire support groups of wives out there, wives support groups for sex and porn addiction. Now, the wives aren't the porn addicts, it's their husbands. I'm serious. They're all over the country, support groups of wives coming together to deal with their husband's sex and porn addiction. And it's almost always closely tied to religious groups, and many of these groups meet in churches. It's very clearly related to religious indoctrination. So, this guy, Dr. Drew, has made an entire industry on addictions, especially sex addictions, and he runs sex addiction rehabilitation centers. Mainly, he's got a lot of them out in California for all the actors to go to, you know, because when you misbehave, I'm a sex addict, I went to treatment, then you get off with, you know, get out of jail free card, basically. And that's what sex addiction does. It lifts the responsibility, and you can get reelected as a senator if you visit prostitutes because you got forgiveness by Jesus and you went through a rehabilitation center. Rehabilitation really means you're back in good standing with your religion. It means nothing about your behavior, about whether you abuse women or you exploit children or any of that sort of stuff. I mean, how many ministers and priests have been forgiven over and over and over again just to go back to do it again? It's not a treatment modality. Now, I want to give you an example. This is a really interesting example. These examples, I could have found 50 of them real quickly. But this is Oxbow Academy, a leading boys as addicts, labeling boys as addicts in Utah. Now, the reason this place exists is it's a rehabilitation center for sex addiction of adolescents. Now, why in hell are you labeling a 12-year-old a sex addict? He barely knows what to do with his penis. He just discovered it last week and it does wonderful things. Why are you telling him he's a porn addict? He just pulled the porn out of his dad's bottom drawer and now you caught him, so he must be a porn addict. That's what you're seeing in a lot of these families. They are so shaming and so uptight sexually. Well, you remember what I said in the video to the reporter interviewer? If you say don't think of a pink elephant, then that's all you can think of. The church says don't do sex, don't do sex. Sex is evil, sex is bad, your body's bad, you were fallen, women are bad. I mean, all these messages just seem to focus and focus and focus. I think the sex addicts are the Christians. I think the sex addicts are the Mormons and the Muslims. All of them are obsessed with sex. They think about sex a lot more than me, and I think about it all the time, practically. So, this group claims that they're a secular organization, but almost every one of their staff members is a Mormon, and every treatment staff member is a Mormon. They claim they're secular, and they take children, and they're all children, 18 or younger, from all over the United States to their organization. Now, they take insurance money. They take Blue Cross Blue Shield. They take all those other places. Interesting. How do they take insurance money if there's no DSM classification for sex or porn addiction? Well, what they do is they tell the parents, well, your child's a sex addict, send him to us and we'll treat him. Then they turn around and they tell the insurance company, this child is depressed, we're treating him for depression. Now, what do they actually do? They don't know shit from Shinola on how to treat depression. They do know how to treat sex addiction. So they go ahead with their sex addiction treatment using the terminology in the reports back to the insurance company of depression. It's a sham. It is a bait and switch. It's a way to get insurance money out of a fake diagnosis. And thousands, millions of dollars in insurance money, your insurance money, by the way, is going to pay these charlatans to treat something that doesn't exist. Now, if you looked at the documentation that the insurance company is getting, it all says depression or bipolar, or psychotic break. It says something that sounds psychological, but that's not what they told the parents. That's not how they got the kid to come in and get the insurance, parents to hand them their insurance card. They said, your son is a sex addict, we're going to treat him for sex addiction. And when the parent goes to visit or talk to him, they're going to use the terminology of sex addiction. Now, a real legitimate treatment facility would be using the terminology of depression or something like that, a real clinical diagnosis, and here's the treatment we're giving these children. Here's the qualifications of these counselors. Todd Spalding is the clinical director. He has a master's degree in social work from Brigham Young University, and Greg Stott at LCSW, Brigham Young University. Do you realize Brigham Young University makes you sign a pledge that you will never masturbate and you will not have sex before marriage? What kind of training are you getting there in sex? That's why they're the biggest sex addiction training center in the United States, practically, because these guys never masturbate. They got to put their energy somewhere. So, there's no credible research, zero, nada, none, zilch. There's no recidivism studies, there's no randomized studies, there's no blind, double-blind studies, there's no follow-up long-term studies. There's nothing in the literature about sex and porn addiction and its proper treatment. Nothing at all. There's just a hell of a lot of common sense, mostly coming from religious organizations. So sex and porn addiction are diseases of religion. Think about that. When I left religion, I lost a hell of a lot of my guilt and shame about sex. And what we've seen, and I've heard this so many times, but the literature actually shows, and I mean literate, peer-reviewed literature shows that the more religious you are, the more likely you are to be viewing porn. We less religious and secular people actually view less porn. We still view porn, but we view less of it. What's the highest porn viewing state in the nation? Utah. What's the second? Number 2. Mississippi. Oklahoma's probably right behind them, I'm not sure. So if you eliminate religious notions, and sex-related problems are oftentimes much easier to treat. I am not saying people don't have trouble with sex. I'm saying when you put guilt and shame into the mix, it really, really complicates the treatment, because you first of all start off with a misdiagnosis. So I'm going to diagnose you with leukemia, and we're going to start treating you for leukemia. Never mind, you've just got a cold, but we're going to treat you for leukemia. That's basically what's going on here. You misdiagnose somebody, you treat them, you charge a lot of money for it, it doesn't work. Well, the problem was with you. It wasn't with the treatment or the lack of diagnostic criteria. My friend and colleague, again, I'm going to quote from Dr. Marty Klein out of San Francisco, licensed psychologist, made a hugely important article, published it in the American Humanist magazine about a year ago, called "You Are Addicted to What?" And he goes into some great detail. I really urge you to get online and read his article. It sums it all up really quickly, even faster than I can do it in this talk. But he has 2 books out, America's War on Sex and Sexual Intelligence, both I recommend. But what do you think? This guy got a sex addiction problem? He sent somebody some texts of his naked whatever. Does that make you a sex addict? Well, what about that guy that was visiting prostitutes on a regular basis? Is he a sex addict? Yeah. I don't know if he is or not, but this guy did something much less, and he lost his seat in Congress. David Vitter got reelected as a senator because he went and got forgiveness. This guy said, I ain't getting forgiveness. I don't need forgiveness. All right. Hey, do you think these guys are sex addicts? They had to have sex for all 19 of those kids. Somebody's getting a lot of sex there. And how about this guy right here who just got caught a week or 2 ago doing something with one or more of these sisters of his, a little incestuousness there going on. I think Jim Bob may be a sex addict, but we haven't found out just yet. It hasn't come out that he actually looks at pornography too. This was for Vicki Garrison's benefit, by the way. I appreciate all that she's doing right now. Here's a great book by Dr. David Ley, one of the few people that's come right out and said this is all bullshit and wrote a whole book on it, The Myth of Sex Addiction. It's an excellent book. You read that book, you'll realize all this stuff is crazy and mixed up. And it's led to a whole cottage industry by that Patrick Carnes guy. Do you think Bill Clinton is a sex addict for wanting to get a blowjob once in a while? I don't know. But he didn't inhale. That we know he's not. He's not a drug addict, at least. So a diagnosis of sex addiction is superfluous at best and dangerous, a dangerous distraction to actual good treatment, according to David Ley. It's easier to say that sex is a problem rather than trying to identify the individual issues that might lead an individual to sex-related problems. Usually when people have sex-related problems, there's something underneath that. It's not the sex, it's the diagnosis, it's a symptom. Sexual addiction is the latest tool in the anti-sex morality embedded in our culture at its deepest levels, labeling sexuality as dangerous, evil temptation that must be constantly constrained and feared. And that's from David Ley. And here's our non-gay sex, pray the gay away. My gaydar is really going off right now with him. All right, so look at this. Where's the porn belt? Well, it's right. It comes across Oklahoma pretty strongly, it looks to me like. If you just look at a great book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts, they show that the more religious zip codes even, the more religious you are, the more porn you're probably watching. Religious people are more likely to be addicted to porn in self-reports. This is a legislator who's supporting anti-gay and porn legislation in Florida as he looks on his computer during the legislative session while he's getting his bill put forward. Just Republican senator there. Porn viewing habits were no different between religious and non-religious people, but perception of addiction related closely to religiosity. That's from several different studies that have been done recently. We're surprised that the amount of viewing did not impact the perception of addiction, but strong moral beliefs did. That's from a recent study by Joshua Grubbs and Case Western University. I don't know, was he a sex addict, because he liked to have lots of sex? What we see in the sex addictions industry is there's abstinence only, there's moral judgment, there's poorly defined diagnostic criteria, and there's culturally and religiously biased stuff. There is no way any of this can possibly be of help to anyone. Mae West, she said, I was once pure as snow, but then I drifted. Was she a sex addict? I don't know. Yes, but there are problematic sexual behaviors. I have no doubts about that, no problems with that. But to call it an addiction is totally inappropriate because we don't have the criteria for that. And there's no diagnosis for it. So are these problems, is Larry Craig, he goes around knocking on bathrooms in airports to see if he can get some gay sex. Is he a sex addict? After a divorce, a man masturbates this is a little test for you. A man masturbates 4 times a day after he gets divorced. Is he a sex addict? A husband is away on a military duty and his wife picks up men at local bars. Is she a sex addict? A teenage boy steals porn magazines from the gas station. Is he a sex addict? A single woman says she never wants to be married. She prefers affairs with married men, says they're less trouble. I've heard all of these and many, many more. Tell me, which one of these is a sex addict? No, there may be some problematic behaviors here. They're acting out. The divorced man, he's probably depressed as hell. Has nothing to do with sex. He's trying to deal with his depression. And I could go through the list. If you do a proper diagnosis, you can actually do a proper treatment for somebody like this. Okay, so harmful behaviors need treatment and assistance. Yes, there are harmful behaviors that are related to sex and sexuality. The addiction label adds nothing to the diagnosis, and it shames people. People who feel ashamed actually avoid treatment, and their problem gets worse oftentimes. And of course, I've said before, there's no objective criteria. A soldier in Afghanistan without any sex, he is without a partner. What's he doing? He's masturbating a lot, probably. Does that make him a sex or porn addict? He likes to look at porn. Does that make him an addict? What's the problem here? Well, it's creeping into our judicial system. Judges are using this criteria, and it's irrelevant to any kind of sentencing. Children are being labeled as addicts at such incredibly young ages. Parents are being told by clergy and by teachers that their child is a sex or a porn addict. Religious groups are using it in their abstinence-only training and telling people you become a sex addict if you look at porn on the internet. Children are calling each other sex addicts. Children in the locker room are saying you're a sex addict because you looked at porn. Who is a child to be labeling somebody a sex addict? That's the kind of criteria diagnosis is happening. Media are telling us that people are sex addicts. Oprah tells us people are sex addicts. Dr. Drew, and so forth and so forth. So, what does it matter? Well, according to Dr. Klein, when homosexuality was called a mental illness, it mattered. When women were called frigid or nymphomaniacs or hysterics, it mattered. When a patient is diagnosed or possessed by the devil instead of schizophrenic, it clearly matters. It determines the treatment to be used and who is qualified to administer the treatment. Right now, ministers think they're qualified to administer the treatment for sex and porn addiction that they themselves diagnosed. That's fucked up. So, here's a scientific approach to treatment. I could go on a whole nother talk just about this. We need to understand the underlying beliefs that people have when they're acting out. We need to look for depression. We need to look for compulsive behavior. We need to look for self-destructive behavior. We need to understand the current circumstances. For example, are they recently divorced? Or are they have an illness? Or there's something else going on? We need to probably understand their childhood training. And you know, the one thing I almost never hear from psychologists is what religion were you raised in, or what were you taught as a child about sex? That can fuck people up worse than almost anything else. If you listen to my podcast, you'll hear how many people tell me on the podcast the terrible religious training they were given. And it led to divorce. It led for all sorts of other kinds of things because of the training they got. So one treatment method, one of the most popular and useful one, is called harm reduction. I won't go into any detail about it, but it's sure a hell of a lot better than Alcoholics Anonymous or Sexaholics Anonymous. Sex therapists, I want to make a big distinction between sex therapists and sex addiction therapists. You can go to the website of the National Organization of Sex Therapy. They never once use the term sex addiction. They don't believe in it. There's no criteria for it. They don't use it. They can't treat it. So, sex therapists would never use this term. If you hear a sex therapist talking about sex addiction, get the hell out of there. They don't know what they're talking about. It doesn't appear anywhere in the website of the American Board of Sexology. Again, because it's not valid criteria. So, what do you do if you encounter a sex addiction counselor? Get the hell out. All right, now, I just say, in order to understand this, show me the science. That's all I want. Show me the science. If you got good scientific criteria for doing something, then we'll move forward. But so far, we have no science. Now, let me conclude by saying I'm not a Christian. And I don't have to act like a Christian. And yet I see so many atheists out there being uptight about their bodies, about their sexuality, about how they talk about sex, how they interact with their spouse or their partner about sex. And that's part of the reason I wrote my book, Sex and God. I want to help us get over that shit. There's no reason for us to be uptight sexually. That's what religion does to us. And we can deprogram ourselves in this area. So it's religion. Sex is religion's weak spot. It's the place that's they're most vulnerable. And you know how we know that? Because that's what they're always talking about. So I'm always challenging people. I went and spoke out in San Francisco area to a group of evangelical fundamentalist teenagers. I don't know why they invited me, because the first thing I ask them is, do you masturbate? I do. And not one of them raised their hand. And you know, they were all jacking off that night, girls and boys. I think we should follow the lead of the gay community. They've been very open about their sexuality. My gay friends have taught me a lot about just chilling out, being happy with who I am. This is the only body I'm ever going to get. I need to be happy with my body. There's no shame. There's no blame in it. It's just me. And I see that in my gay friends. I love it. So we need to use be out about our sexuality. And here's one way to do it. Say something like, sure, I fornicate just like lots of religious people do. Sure, I masturbate. Don't you? I think that's a perfectly legitimate. I'm not afraid to talk about or say it. Sure, I enjoy pornography just like most religious people. They just can't admit it. I think we ought to be dumping this back in their lap. Don't let them shame us for what they're doing. We know they're doing it. I didn't stop. I kept talking about masturbation for about 20 more minutes until the leader said, can we get on to something besides masturbation? I loved it. That meant he really was uncomfortable. Okay, so we need to frame their behavior. Control of women's bodies and control of women's sexuality is really the key to successful religious infection. You want to get a God virus in somebody, you infect the women. And that's what most patriarchal cultures do. So we need to challenge their behavior, and here's one of the ways to do it. We can say, I take birth control because I like sex, inside or outside of marriage, just like Newt Gingrich and Rush Limbaugh do. This asshole was shaming, what's her name, about wanting birth control, and he's got 4 wives. This guy has probably screwed more women than he's got fingers, toes, and, I don't know, bills in Congress to count. All right, so I am a secular sexual. I am out about it. And I want you to leave here, I want you to be proud to be a secular sexual. You're somebody who's got a sexuality about you, and you should not be ashamed of it. Thanks so much for your attention today.
And that is the presentation from June 20th at Free OK 2015, the Oklahoma Free Thought Convention. Dr. Darrel Ray, The Myth of Sex Addiction. A provocative presentation with a lot of interesting stuff in there, and I wanted to take a few moments to perhaps go deeper into some of the things that were mentioned. And so I've asked Dr. Darrel Ray to join us for a few minutes on the radio tonight to extend the discussion. Darrel, great to have you. Thanks for coming.
Well, glad to be on here again, Seth.
Usually when we're talking about sex, sexual issues in the church, sexual sins, usually it targets the men. As if women don't have sex, enjoy sex, women don't masturbate, women don't use porn. Can you speak to that? I mean, is it male heavy, or is this something to do with how the church perceives women? I mean, what's that about?
No. I think they're just different messages. There's messages for men and there's messages for women, but they come across as they look like they're not sexual necessarily. But this whole purity culture thing is definitely focused on the female. You should stay pure until you're married. You should not have premarital sex. You know, all those messages are clearly for women. They're not for men. The men's side says you shouldn't masturbate. You shouldn't use pornography. It's the same message, but targeted towards the audience, you know. Men clearly masturbate at a high rate, more than women. That's what the sexual data shows. So that's a pretty good message to give men. Don't masturbate. And then when you tell them not to, they feel bad and they have to come back to the church for forgiveness. Women, on the other hand, women's sex drive is just as strong as men's, if not stronger. And they're told, stay pure until you're married. Well, they're not going to stay pure. I mean, the statistics show people that take the purity pledge have just as much premarital sex as people who don't. They just wait about 3 months longer to get started. I mean, there is evidence that it delays maybe 3 months. But when they start having sex, they do it unprotected. They do it because they've been taught condoms don't work and that sort of stuff. So women then have sex, and they have to come back to church to get forgiveness. And that's why we see this entire, not just the purity culture, but there's a new virgin culture. I don't know if you've heard about that.
There was a part of a True Love Waits campaign that I had seen decades ago where for those usually girls who had lost their virginity, instead of telling them, well, you're without hope, they came up with some sort of a deal where if you come and you sort of throw yourself down at the altar and ask for forgiveness, you can reset in some way and become a new virgin. Was that what you're talking about?
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And it's even more so today. There's entire groups of, I forget the name of it, but basically you can become a virgin again if you just pray to Jesus, and he'll make you a virgin again. Like you're going to forget all the fun you had the first time around, or 27 times around, or however many times you had before you decide to become a virgin again. It's just nuts. I mean, it really is nuts, and it will drive somebody nuts. I mean, think about it. Telling somebody to be something that's so unhuman, unnatural, is going to create all sorts of conflict and a lot of depression. I see, and I have seen in my practice and my interaction with other psychologists, how much depression is caused by these crazy ideas about our sexuality. I mean, suicide even. You see, gay people who are just totally depressed based upon the way they're being treated and rejected by their families, their religious institutions, and sometimes it leads to suicide. It certainly leads to social isolation. It has nothing to do with your sexuality. It has everything to do with the religion's view and treatment of people.
Perhaps one of the more controversial things you said in the speech at the Oklahoma Free Thought Convention, I say it's controversial because it's counterintuitive, especially for those of us who come out of the church, is that there's no such thing as a sex addict. You want to qualify that for me?
I don't need to qualify it. There is no such thing. We have...
Dumbass. Just sorry, Darrel. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
For 20 years, committees of psychologists have been looking at this to see if it needs and can be included in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for the United States in North America, and put out by the American Psychiatric Association. And those committees over and over again have come to the conclusion that we can't define it. It's just almost impossible to define what sex addiction is. So rather than try to define the symptom, because it's a symptom, this behavior is a symptom of something else, over and over again, they conclude that the main reason people are maybe inappropriately behaving sexually is because there's something else going on underneath. I mean, say, if a child has been abused sexually, is it any wonder that they might express themselves inappropriately in some way, shape, or form? So it's not the sexual behavior, it's the abuse that needs to be looked at and treated.
So if there's someone who's, let's say he's masturbating to pornography to the point where he's checking out of his everyday life, he's disconnected from his partner, he's late for work, I mean, is he not a sex addict?
No, he may be depressed. He may be obsessive, maybe compulsive. There may be a lot of things underneath. But one thing, he may be really is guilt-ridden about his sexual behavior. And he may be being labeled as a sex addict by his spouse. Now, let's be clear about this. The people who are identifying and diagnosing sex addicts are preachers and spouses and Sunday school teachers and parents. There's no psychologists out there doing it because we don't have a criteria to do it. If you're going to use a diagnosis in the psychological world, it has to be based on scientific criteria that have been validated in a wide range of environments. And we can't do that with sex addicts. Now, the person you just described, let's assume it's a man. His wife might be a Facebook addict. Is anybody labeling her a Facebook addict? She spends 5 hours a day on Facebook. She's been known to look at Facebook during work hours and not get as much work done. Is she a Facebook addict? I mean, the thing is that once you put sex into it, it somehow becomes something very different.
You're saying that these are symptoms of a more deep problem.
Yeah. The other problem, the deep problem may be a relationship problem. Maybe they're having real marital problems and neither one of them can come to deal with it. Well, if you can't have sex with your spouse, who are you going to have sex with if you don't want to cheat? With yourself. And you might do it more than is reasonable for your schedule. And you might end up missing work. You might end up doing something else. But the key is you need to deal with the relationship issue.
And then that may speak to depression because your marriage is falling apart and you're unhappy in your heart and all these other types of things. So
all those other things, right.
I see. Let's talk about male shame. This is something that you've brought up to me from time to time, and it's something I want to address here again on the radio. Can you define male shame, what you're talking about here?
Well, I think it's best understood in relation to female shame because I think they're two sides of the same coin. And I gave a talk at the American Atheist Convention this last April. It's on YouTube as well. But the concept, we talk about females and we shame females, slut shaming and that sort of stuff. We tell females you shouldn't dress a certain way and all that sort of stuff. But what's happening at the same time as females are growing up and they're being taught that you shouldn't tempt men, and that's really what female shame is all about, we're telling men you should control your women. And control of women is what patriarchal cultures do really, really well. And the way they control women is by shaming women And who's doing most of the shaming, or at least the big part of it, are men. And men are harassing women, their daughters, their wives, other significant women in their life about the way they dress, about the way they think, about the way they express themselves sexually. So what's happening is men are being told, you should control your women. Now, among a bunch of boys growing up, you can see in, say, junior high, boys are kidding each other about sex and sexuality, and you'll hear things like, well, he has to masturbate because he can't get any. Well, that's a male shame thing. We're telling a boy he is less than a man if he masturbates, and he's less than a man if he can't get sex from a woman. Both of those are male shame notions. At the same time, you get this notion that women should kowtow to men. So when a man loses control of his daughter, loses control of his wife, quote unquote, then he feels shame for that. And in some cultures, if a daughter goes out and has sex or even kisses a boy, the father is shamed for losing control of his daughter. And how does he express that? Well, he may do something heinous to his daughter. He may take her out and sell her as a prostitute. He may kill her. There are lots and lots of examples in some patriarchal cultures of killing daughters because they misbehaved, because they didn't follow the patriarchal notion of control. So what I'm trying to show is many men feel the need to control women, and that is directly related to them feeling shame about their own sexuality in relation to women. When you call somebody a pussy in the locker room, you're really saying you're less than a man because you're acting like a girl. So see how those two are related. We shame girls in one way, we shame men in another way, and it leads to a lot of physical and sexual, psychological abuse of women, but it's also an abuse of men and boys as well.
Talking here with Dr. Darrel Ray. I remember, when I was in my adolescence, everything was sort of a test of manhood or pre-manhood. You know, right. It's all about conquest. It's all about who's the better man, who's the bigger man. There's a lot of chest thumping. It just seemed like every day you were being measured. If you were called anything feminine, it was automatically an insult. It was automatically a diminishing of you and your identity. And this happened frequently.
And it's a message. It's a message to gay people. It's a message to transgender people that you are less. The ideal is masculinity, and the ideal is alpha masculinity, if you want to put a scale on it. So you're being constantly compared as a man against that ideal. And if you fall short, then you must be closer to being a female. And female is the lowest you can be. And somewhere in between are other labels. But all of them are shaming of males for being less than the ideal. And patriarchy puts that up there. Paul talks a lot about controlling. A man should be the head of the house. A woman should be subservient. A woman should stay quiet. Well, all these are messages that if your woman's talking in church, then that's your problem as the husband. You need to shut her up.
Go control your woman.
Exactly. And I've seen this in churches over and over again. Men maybe even publicly berating their wives or women in the church for having asserted themselves. It's insidious, especially the more fundamentalist groups.
Darrel, let me ask you about this. I've spoken to many people, male and female, about their religious belief, and a few of the females that I've spoken to are happy in a patriarchal system. They have happily accepted their sort of subservient role. I am the submissive one. My husband is the head of the house. I'm happy to let him make the big decisions. I will respond to his leadership. This gives me joy. And they don't seem to have a problem with it, nor do they seem, at least outwardly, dysfunctional. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, is that a temperament thing? There are just some people who would rather follow than lead? Or is it just the God virus at work in them or something else? I mean, what do you think?
Oh, I think temperament certainly could be. I think the religion takes advantage of that. It says, if somebody's got a temperament of being a follower more than a leader, they feel comfortable in that position. But they would feel comfortable in that position whether they're a Hindu or a Baptist or a Muslim. It wouldn't matter. That temperament feels comfortable when they're not having to make major decisions when they're following somebody else.
So this would be a person who would be uncomfortable with the pressures of those types of decisions, any way you slice it, religious or not. But the religious context sort of gives them a frame.
Yeah.
Perhaps to put around this particular characteristic.
Right. But we see largely non-religious cultures where those people work just fine. I mean, Sweden, there's probably just as many people of that kind of temperament as there is in the United States, and they do just fine without their religion. What you don't know, and we're talking theoretical here, but if I was to get inside that person's head, there'd probably be some signs of stress. You'd probably see cortisone levels being higher or adrenaline levels being higher because they're constantly in an environment that has a strong alpha or strong male figure. There's the fear of violence, there's the fear of retribution, there's the fear of creating anger. And so there's a constant walking on eggs around that center patriarchal figure in the family. And what you don't see, let's say in an Amish family, because I have interviewed Amish women and I've talked to Amish people like that, or I just had a great interview with a Hasidic Jew on my podcast, 2 different conservative Jews. The same thing they describe is you're constantly walking on eggshells against the powerful, dominant, strong, potentially angry and violent man. Well, yeah, you look like you're happy in that situation, but I don't know what the chemicals in the brains are going off. I don't know if you're experiencing a lot of stress around that. And it's a norm to you. You've always been that way. Your mother was that way. Your grandmother was that way. It feels normal. I don't know how many people have told me in my interviews, it was normal to me till I stepped out of it and realized, no, this is not normal. This is abusive. That's what I see. So I'm not going to agree that those people are happy. I'm going to agree that they appear to have taken their place in that particular system.
Darrel, do boys learn their identity as men from their fathers? Do girls learn it from their mothers? Is it more complicated than that?
Yeah, I would look in the locker room a lot more. I would look in the peer. If you look at so-called primitive cultures, they're not, but other cultures where they haven't had Western influence, you see in many cases the uncles are the mentors, but always the peer group. So you get a sense about who it is and what it is to be male in most cultures from the peer group, and generally from those peers that are a little bit older than you. I mean, think about it. When you were in junior high, you looked up to those high school boys who were playing football and playing basketball or whatever. Maybe you didn't, maybe I didn't, but most boys do. So you're looking at what is the pathway to acceptance in this culture, and those boys are showing you the pathway. So in answer to your question, I would look at the peer groups even more than the parents. Parents aren't, there's a lot of research on parenting, and this we can go into a whole other podcast some other day, discussion about this, but there's a lot of evidence that parents don't have nearly as much influence over their children as you think they do, or as we think. I'm a parent, and I look out and I say, man, those kids practically raised themselves. Everything I did, if it was against the personality that they had, didn't work. They're raising themselves, and that's what you see within human culture. Boys and girls, and it's true of girls too, are just programmed by our genetics to look around and find the models that work in this particular culture and follow those models, and those are almost always peers that are a little bit older than you.
Do young people today have, you think, overall, in the United States, a healthier perspective on sexuality? They don't seem to be quite as uptight as their parents.
I think the internet's having a huge impact on that. I don't care what the preachers are saying. Those kids are looking at porn. The minister's looking at porn too, by the way.
Now, is that a good thing? I mean, if I'm a parent of a teenager, do I say, yay, my child is looking at porn?
In our research, what we found was most people are looking at porn by the age of 12 or 13, 14 for sure. And the rate of porn viewing is not much higher, is a little bit higher for secular kids than religious kids. But by the time they're in their late teens, the religious kids are looking at it just as much. Here's the deal. In our culture, in any culture, it's not just ours, in any culture, children are trying to figure out what's sexually appropriate within the context of this culture. Now, if it was the Chinese in China, they would be looking around and seeing that there's no such thing as, there's not even a word for father. There's not even a word for husband. Because in those cultures, there's no such thing as marriage. So the norms that you'd be looking for are very different than they are in our culture, where we have husbands and fathers and all that sort of stuff. So our norms are really culturally based. If you go to the Manganian culture in the South Pacific, the norms there are you can start having premarital sex anytime you want to. Well, that's kind of like the equivalent of you can start looking at porn anytime you want to. And I know lots of fairly liberal parents that are just fine. Let the kid watch porn. There's no evidence whatsoever that porn impacts people's sexuality negatively. None whatsoever. There's been a lot of research. A lot of people try to prove it, but there's just nothing out there. Porn doesn't seem to do anything but teach us how to be sexual beings, or at least give us a release until we become a sexual being. In the Manganian culture, they can start having sex when they're 13, 14 years old. And one of the rules there in that culture is the man, should be able to give his partner at least 3 orgasms for every orgasm he has. Now,
of course.
I've talked about this, so on a number of talks, and I've had a lot of women volunteer to go be a Manganian. But it's a total reverse of the way we see it in our culture. And one of my passions is to educate secularists that we are bound, we have mental chains on our brains by this culture. We need to step outside and look at what human sexuality is if it wasn't constrained by Western Christian notions of sex and sexuality. That's one of them. I think looking at other cultures and comparing how we do things. I mean, these cultures have been going for thousands, maybe 10,000 years with these ideas. And they do just fine. They don't need a patriarchy. They don't need to control women. They don't tell women how to dress or men how to control women. None of those things matter in those cultures. In fact, it's the opposite. The women run the show when it comes to sexuality. And there were a lot of cultures where women did run the show. Women were the sexual leaders of the culture. But what happened was Christianity came in. Christianity came into North America and to South America and Asia. Islam came in. Hinduism came in. Anywhere a patriarchal religion comes, it destroys that feminine leadership in the world of sexuality. Thank goodness we've still got some cultures out there that haven't been destroyed or touched by Christianity. And that gives us an insight into what human sexuality probably was 5,000 or 10,000 years ago. You got to remember, it's only been in the last 100 years that most people have lived in cities. And 300 years ago, most people were untouched. 400 years ago, for sure, most people were untouched by Christianity. So it's really cool to think about and to look at what those cultures' sexual practices were 400 or 500 years ago before Christianity came in and, screwed it all up.
Dr. Darrel Ray, let's talk about the God virus.
Sure.
We're talking about the church telling you you're broken, you're doing it wrong, you're tainted, and certainly sexually you're dysfunctional without God. And if you'll come in and give us 10% of your income and follow our rules and allow us control of you, your life, your family, your bedroom, well, we'll make it all better. They have sold you the sickness and then they sell you the cure. Pretty convenient.
It's excellent. That's a great summarization. Thanks.
Well, I read the book, so I mean, but I mean, it's such a perfect a marketing scenario, to establish the need, right? To establish the demand, and then to meet the demand. And they just hook these people and bring them back in, often with a cloud of guilt hanging over their heads. It's tragic.
Yeah, and it starts very young. In fact, if you don't get somebody pretty young, you're less likely. You're probably 70% likely to keep and infect somebody if you can get them before they're 3 or 4 years old. That goes way down to 30% if you don't get them by 12 or 13.
What do you mean 3 or 4? I mean, can someone be taught sexual messages at 3 and 4?
At that time in your life, you're learning your native language. So you speak English, so do I, but it doesn't matter. Whatever culture you're in, you're learning your native language at age 1, 2, 3. You're also learning the language of sex at 1, 2, 3. We don't think of children as sexual beings, but they really are. And they're touching themselves. They're observing adults. They're looking for the clues of how you're going to survive. And that's the issue. How are you going to survive in this environment, in this particular culture? And boys and girls are watching their parents behave and interact with each other. All these messages are coming through loud and clear. So they've learned English, and they're learning that masturbation is wrong. I just had an interview with somebody yesterday, and I said, how did you know when you were in 4th grade that masturbation was wrong? And she could not tell me where she learned that message. She thought and thought and thought. I don't know. I just knew at 4th grade that it was wrong, that I was shameful. I was doing something wrong. And she also had the notion that if she did it underneath the covers, God couldn't see her. I thought, I've heard that so many times. I even thought that myself when I was in 4th grade masturbating. If I do it under the covers, God can't see me. Where are those messages coming from? Well, they're deep. How did you, when you were learning English, you didn't sit and think, maybe, wish my mom should be teaching me Chinese instead of English. You didn't think that. And you didn't think, my mother should be teaching me sex-positive notions and ideas when you're 3 years old. That's just not a part of the equation of that. But once you've got the language embedded, you just do it naturally. You don't think how to speak English.
Sort of learn by osmosis in some ways. You're just always around it.
Same thing is true of sex. You just learn it by osmosis. Then when you start becoming sexual, when you start becoming, first of all, sexual with yourself, and then later with someone else, you bring those notions right into that relationship. And I mean a relationship with yourself. Because when you think about looking at porn or masturbating, you also think about the lessons you learned about touching yourself is wrong, looking at nude figures is wrong, looking at sex on the internet is wrong. All those things come in, yet you still do it. Then you have this guilt. So what religion has done is it's infected you with this notion of sex negativity, just like you were infected, so to speak, with English. Now, some infections are good. Some memes, I talk about memes in my book. Some memes are good. They're functional. Some are dysfunctional. Some want to get into your brain and take over your brain so you infect the next generation. And that's what religion's trying to do. If it can get you by 3, 4, 5 years old, it's pretty well got you. And the evidence for that you can see in somebody that's, say, 35 years old. And they weren't particularly religious or not, it didn't seem to be religious. And then one day they have a crisis. They get diagnosed with cancer or their spouse dies or, some tragic things happen. And all of a sudden they get Jesus and they go back. Now, where did they go back? Do they go back to Allah? They don't become a Buddhist. They go generally back to what they were taught when they were 3, 4, 5 years old. Almost always they go back to that spot because that's where they're most comfortable. And that's where the infection shows. When I talk about the God virus, I liken it to chickenpox. If you got chickenpox as a child, you've got it the rest of your life. It can come out later in life as shingles. It's still the same virus. In fact, you as a shingles, if you express shingles, you can give chickenpox to children. People are having a shingles attack. Well, the same thing is true in religion. If you get infected early enough, it's there your whole life. And part of our job, and what you and I are trying to do, is help people deprogram themselves or find workarounds in their brain for this infection that they got when they're very, very young. You can get a vaccine for shingles that'll keep it from coming out later in life. Well, I think that's what you and I are doing. We're trying to vaccinate people against the shingles coming out. The God virus reappearing when you go through some crisis.
The God virus and sex and God. I'm not just because Darrel's a buddy, but because the reason I admire him and want him on the radio is because his work is just fantastic. And, I grew up in such a repressed culture, and it leads me into, I won't keep you too much longer, but it leads me into something very quickly that I wanted to address, if I may. And I think we may have spoken about this years ago, but I want to come back to it. The age of sexual maturity for young men, young women, well, let's call it 13, 14. I don't even know what that number is, right?
Yeah.
And the median age, the average age that people get married, that gap has gotten wider and wider and wider, right? They're not jumping into a marital relationship largely at the age of 18.
Right.
But often in their, late 20s, perhaps? Is there a number, Darrel?
Yeah, 27 is the current. Now that's averaging men and women. Men are married a little bit later, women.
So we're talking about a huge window of years, well over a decade.
Well, plus puberty has gone down. That's another thing. Nobody seems to know why. The onset of puberty for girls and for boys has gone down, but especially for girls.
So if they're preaching that premarital sex is adultery, it's sin.
Yeah.
If they're preaching the shame message, then you have this huge window of time in the order of a decade plus, 12, 13 plus years, that it becomes a sexual sin. It becomes an opportunity for shame and guilt and all of the baggage that comes along with it. It just seems like as those two dates go further and further apart, it allows the church a greater window to come in and preach the message of guilt and shame to you.
Right. But I think that's also why we're seeing the church attendance and membership falling precipitously in many areas, because it's just unrealistic. You're going to get up like Mark, what's his name, at Mars Church and talk about how terrible it is to touch yourself. and half your people are 27 years old and still not married. That's crazy. And even they can figure that out. Plus,
so they're in the pews and they're like, I don't have to listen to this bullshit. I mean, is that what you're saying is happening? You know?
Skill is out to lunch. The guy's crazy, I think, but he's out to lunch when it comes to human sexuality. And any minister that preaches that way, or any priest, and that's what the Catholic Church has done. Catholic Church is trying to tell people that you shouldn't masturbate, you shouldn't have premarital sex, the priest should be celibate. All these things are just, people can figure out this is crazy. The church can no longer isolate people from good, high-quality sexual information. So that leads them to just leave the church. I mean, they don't want to have to deal with the guilt that the Baptists are putting on them. Baptists are losing members right and left. Catholic Church would not exist hardly in the United States if it wasn't for immigration. The Latino community is keeping the Catholic Church alive. It's dying quickly, and the amount of giving coming in is just dying quickly within the Catholic Church.
So people are now refusing to receive sexual messages from lifetime celibates. That's encouraging to hear, Darrel. Yeah.
Well, I can't prove it all, but I will say the research seems to show that people are starting to get wise about human sexuality, even if they're having to educate themselves. However, it doesn't matter. Once people leave religion, they still carry these messages in their brain. And that's my mission, if you will, to help people figure out how to deprogram themselves so they can have a satisfying sex life with themselves or with somebody else. I don't care. And it doesn't matter whether it's with a male, female, transgender, it doesn't matter. Have a glorious, fun sex life with somebody else without the guilt and shame that you were taught as a child.
Dr. Darrel Ray, author of the book Sex and God and the God Virus, and host of the Secular Sexuality podcast, which I will link, by the way, in the description box. Thanks for spending a few minutes to kind of cap the Free OK presentation with some extra input with kind of a deeper perspective. And thanks for your great work out there. You're setting people free, man. Or maybe more accurately, you're giving them a reminder that it's okay to set themselves free. Would that be an accurate way to put it?
Very good. Perfect. Thanks.
Dr. Ray, thanks so much. Thanks so much for listening tonight. I'll see you next Tuesday as we talk about the loose screws, apologetics gone wild. And a huge thanks again to tonight's show's sponsor. Visit their website sometime this evening if you can and just check them out. It's evolvefish.com. And I'll see you next week.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.